What we want is the partition of the United States and a country for everyone. The partition will take into account the proportion of people of varying ideologies and nationalities who wish for a country for themselves, and make the country size based on the proportion of the population centered around where each group is the most populated. The United States will not exist forever. States do not exist forever. They come and they go. It is inevitable. Not even China can claim to have existed forever. Ancient Egypt, especially if it proves to be older than what mainstream historians believe, may come the closest, but can we really say that it's the same country as when it was founded? To what extent is China the same country as it was 100 years ago? Or is the United States the same country as it was in 1900 or 1860 or 1866? The United States is more similar to Canada in 2013 than it is to itself in 1964. And if we consider Canada a different country, how much more so is the United States a different country from what it was in 1964? If we consider Canada a different country today, then we must certainly consider the United States a different country from what it was in 1964. In 1942, 30 of 48 states had anti-race mixing laws. And in 1958, 94% of the population supported these laws. And since the United States was only 85% white at the time, this means that at minimum, half of the non-whites also supported the anti-race mixing laws. Now, if you support anti-race mixing laws today, well then you are completely out of step with the United States today. If you oppose them, well then the America you support bears no resemblance to the America that fought and won World War II, that had the Civil War, that had the Revolution from Britain, or even the America of 1958. That is, if you support anti-race mixing laws, then your America is dead, dead, and dead. If you oppose anti-race mixing laws, well then your America is a country that came into being in 1965 at the earliest. Your country does not have a history. I mean, you could say, oh, Constitution, well, that's a different country. It's the same flag, it's a completely different country. So specifically regarding the United States, that anti-secessionism could exist in any substantial numbers is a very strange thing. And I can only conclude that it is a product of people just not thinking much about it. Legality. This is an amazing argument that secession can't be done because it's illegal. Okay, well first off, secession from Britain was illegal. Republics breaking off from the USSR was illegal, yet there they are. And I personally believe what Benjamin Franklin meant by a republic, if you can keep it, was that secession was likely and allowed to occur. Keeping the republic meant keeping these states in the Union. However, that is just my opinion. But why does the legality of it ever enter into the discussion? Right? We're talking about the creation of a new state, a new legal order, and your argument against a new legal order is, well, the old legal order says no. Following the secession of the states, which became known as the Confederate States of America, the United States military had several military installations in the CSA, and most of these had their garrisons evacuated. But in Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the garrison was not evacuated, and after a prolonged standoff, CSA troops fired a few cannons, and the 85 men in Fort Sumter surrendered. Now, 2 of the men were actually killed, but they were killed during a salute of the flag prior to taking it down. None were actually killed in the bombardment. For those who don't know, South Carolina is well within the borders of the CSA. And it was this attack, this Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, that was used to justify the invasion of the CSA. That's the formal legal justification. Now, you can say whether this was the real cause or not, or what any of this had to do with slavery, but the cold legality of it is that Lincoln claimed that by firing on troops that had been in South Carolina for 4 months after South Carolina had seceded, the Confederate States of America had attacked the United States. This was the formal legal justification for the invasion of the Confederate States of America. One might say that the real issue was slavery, or that the CSA did not deserve its independence because it held slaves, and I am sympathetic to this argument, but this was not the justification for war with the CSA at the outset. Now, was Brazil denied their independence? And is Brazil denied their independence to this very day? After all, Brazil not only held slaves, but they held more slaves than the United States ever did. Economies of scale and prosperity. Now, this is an argument that also astounds me. The argument is that in a big union, the individual states benefit from the economies of scale and free trade access that comes from a large country. Now, the first problem with this is that the argument could be used for a global state, from which there's absolutely no escape. There's no possibility of breaking out unless they allow you to. And the second problem is that this is just wrong empirically. Countries like the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, Hong Kong, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, Ireland today, that they adopted more of a free market economic policies. Luxembourg, Switzerland, Austria is about as wealthy as Germany. Okay? All very prosperous countries, and they benefit from economies of scale just fine. And they contribute more than their share to world science and manage their trade just fine. So this idea of you got to be a big country to be rich is just kind of not quite sure where it comes from. I understand the logic by it, but there's you need more than just a little theory. You got to actually show that it happens, and it doesn't happen. Okay, racism. This is a major bugaboo. Now, the first question, of course, is what is racism? What do they mean by racism? Do they mean people making racist jokes? That's probably not what they mean. Okay, they probably mean some sort of racially biased law or some sort of legal injustice upon people based on race. Okay, well, so what racially aggressive policies do the separatists propose, and why would these racist policies be bad? Right? I mean, you could say that they're racist, but that's one thing, and then, well, the next thing is to say why they're bad. If you know anything about the All Nations Party, you know that we support racial separatists of all types. This involves explicitly racial states with various race laws. Now, this isn't the only form of separatism that we support, nor is it the largest or what most people are in the ANP for, but it is the most problematic since people in the United States have this incredible hang-up on race and racism. Now, if you oppose strict immigration policies, for example, if you oppose immigration policies that say no non-whites in your country, well, what do you think about Israel's immigration policy? Right? Or what do you think about Israel banning marriages between Jews and non-Jews? What do you think about that? Should Israel be invaded and destroyed because of their race laws? What about Japan's immigration policy? Should Japan be invaded and have their sovereignty revoked because they have rather illiberal views on immigration policy? Maybe the secessionist group will one day be aggressive. This is certainly possible, but it doesn't seem very likely. Another word for secession would be escape. It is what weaker parties do to try to escape a tyrannical union. And so to imagine that the racial separatists will do what exactly and try to invade who? If anything, a separatist group, a group that separates from the United States, if the United States remains otherwise intact, the group that has the most to fear are the separatists themselves. So are you saying that we shouldn't let the USSR break up because a reunified Germany might invade Poland again? Is that the logic we're using? And if your great concern is aggression, well, Japan and Germany were aggressive and engaged in explicitly racial wars against their neighbors and did something that the Confederate States of America did not do, which is declare war on other countries, attack them based on racial supremacist ideologies. Right? The CSA was attacked. So, should those countries, Japan and Germany, should they be denied their sovereignty today? Should Japan be incorporated into the United States today out of fear that they might invade Korea again? And if your concern is aggression, well, why do Egypt, Jordan, and Syria still exist after repeated attempts to invade Israel and explicitly saying, we want to drive them into the sea and saying we want to kill them all, we want to kill all the Jews there? Why is North Korea allowed sovereignty after an aggressive invasion of the south of the country? And while we're at it, why don't we incorporate the United Kingdom and France into the United States, since the United Kingdom and France invaded about half the world, right? Or what about Mongolia? They once ruled about half the world as well, quite a while ago, but don't want those passions flaming up again. Maybe that's not the problem. Maybe the problem is that a separate state from the U.S. will do mean things to certain minorities within their borders. If a new Europe forms in the Pacific Northwest, maybe they'll be mean to black people or something. Maybe, but this is a hypothetical. This isn't proven. It's also possible that the U.S. will do mean things to their minorities right now. More importantly, the crime hasn't been committed. And by denying cession, it would be like saying, well, in the past, the Japanese were quite savage to other ethnicities, and the kinds of people who support Japanese independence from the U.S. could be the same kinds of people who supported race-based oppression in Imperial Japan. So let's force Japan into a union with the United States because they might do it now, even though they have no signs of wanting to do it now. But beyond that, I think the kind of person who opposes secession would have supported the aggressive racial policies in Japan back then. Right? Because the thug and the bully, they tend to be zealots for the status quo, whatever it is. Right? And in the past, they'd be brown shirts. Today, they're screaming about how horrible racism is and that secession should not be allowed because racism. But in the United States, the situation is even more absurd. Because all of the race laws in the United States, for example, prohibiting interracial marriage and prohibiting non-European immigration, and before that, outright slavery, okay? All of these laws were expressly supported by the United States federal government at the time. And these race laws were as nothing compared to the race laws in Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Brazil, and even India in the 1960s in their caste system. So let's get this straight. Germany, Brazil, India, and Japan are allowed their own countries, despite race laws which were far more extensive than what existed in the CSA, and far more extensive than what existed in the Jim Crow South. Even though the race laws in the CSA and later the Jim Crow South were expressly supported by the U.S. federal government at the time. But the CSA must not be allowed independence because of these federal government-endorsed race laws that they held, which were less draconian than the race laws other countries, which are allowed to have sovereignty now, which are less draconian than the laws that they had. There's no consistency here. This doesn't make any sense. There is no logic to anti-secessionism. The reality of secession. When Ukraine seceded from the Soviet Union, did they threaten the sovereignty of Russia? When Slovakia seceded from Czechoslovakia, did Slovakia then go on to become a great enemy of the Czech Republic? When Canada and Australia and New Zealand seceded from Britain, did they go on to threaten Britain? The United States is the only country that really came close to being a threat to the country that it seceded from. But of course, the U.S. is the very country I'm saying should be broken up. For example, when Brazil seceded from Portugal, did Brazil become a mortal enemy of Portugal? In the United States, the group wanting secession has always been the weaker party. It was clearly the weaker party at the time of the United States invasion of the CSA, and those currents which led to the CSA have only gotten relatively weaker. Horror stories about secessionist belligerents go against the lessons of history and are based on absurd hypotheticals that fly in the face of the facts. Let me draw a parallel that may disturb many staunch Americanists. The Soviet Union, in November of 1922, viewed itself as the heir to the Russian Empire, meaning that they were the rightful owners of Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland, along with what they already controlled. One may be confused as to how the USSR could be so heavy-handed against Finland and the Baltic states, and later against Poland. Okay, well, the reason for this was that the USSR saw this as merely a continuation of the Russian Civil War, and considered the countries of Poland and Finland to be just as much a white faction, a loyalist faction, as, say, the UFA Directory, the Archangel government, or the Volunteers Army. And so the Soviet invasion of Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states can be seen as anti-secession actions. Right? These were territories that had seceded from the Soviet Union during the Civil War and managed to stay out for a while, and the USSR simply saw it as a continuation of the Russian Civil War, preventing their secession. In 1953, the USSR sent in troops to crush anti-Soviet uprisings in Berlin, neo-Nazi uprisings in Berlin. In 1956, Hungary attempted secession from the Soviet Union, and they were similarly crushed. In 1968, Prague attempted secession, also crushed. So based on this history, if you were looking at the situation in the Soviet Union in 1968, based on this history, it would seem that the USSR would never tolerate secession. And yet, in 1991, the USSR disintegrated without a single war or battle. The states began to break off, and the USSR just let them. It was possible that the Soviet military could clamp down and deny secession like they did as recently as 1968, but guess what? They didn't. Moreover, the economic situation of the USSR, while poor in 1991, was certainly better off than it was in, say, 1920, when the Soviets had no problem raising armies and fighting wars and going through all the hardship that a war entailed. But while they were in a better position to do that in 1991, they chose not to. It was a matter of will, not material resources. The ideology was drained. The farce was up. In 1861, the United States didn't allow the Southern Confederation of Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia to secede. Now, it's possible that the U.S. wouldn't allow secession today. It's possible. It's also possible that they would have as much respect for self-determination as the Soviet Union in 1991 did. It's also possible that they would have less respect for self-determination than the Soviet Union did. It's also possible that people in the United States will recognize the farce and the hypocrisy of opposing secession in a country that owes its origins to illegal secession, and just how deranged the creepy cult of the Sacred Union is. Where does anti-secession come from? According to Rasmussen in July 2012, 24% of the people in the United States believes that 50 states have a right to secede, 59% believe they don't, and 17% are undecided. Now, while unscientific, my perusal of forums have found anti-secessionism to be quite common. What on earth do these people think they would be fighting for if they were to fight against secession? The United States? America? What is America? Is it the land? Are they fighting for the land? Don't think anybody would say that. Well, if it's an ideology, well, what is the ideology? Is the U.S. any more free than Canada? If you want to point to the Constitution, well, you're pointing to your interpretation of it. And even that is merely a potential, not something realized, and arguably it was never realized. And if you want your interpretation of the U.S. Constitution realized, well, I fail to see how maintaining a union with people who have very different views helps you realize your goal, unless you're just irredentist and bigot. So let's get real. The United States' best days are behind it. American triumphalism is a thing of the past. The debt-to-GDP ratio continues to grow, and neither party is willing to solve it. Neither party will solve it. Okay? Neither party will solve it. The United States cannot pay for the entitlement programs that exist today as of January 2013. Right? As of January 2013, the United States is not paying for these entitlement programs from the taxes it raises. Now, while the bogus unemployment rate in the U.S. may go down, the percentage of the U.S. population aged 18 to 65 which actually has a job has kept falling. In 2006, the labor force participation rate was 63.1%. In 2011, it was down to 58.4%. Okay? Which is funny. Like, how can this happen if the unemployment rate keeps falling? Well, the BLS official unemployment rate that you see bandied about in the media so much stops counting people after 6 months unemployed, and it just assumes that those people don't want to work anymore. Funny how more and more people just don't want to work anymore. We can also look at the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio over time. In 2008, it was 69.5%. The debt was 69.5% of U.S. GDP. In 2012, it was 104.8% of GDP. Right? Growth in an economy comes from investment, and investment depends on savings. People simply aren't willing to invest in the United States. They don't even trust the U.S. Treasury. 80% of all bonds nowadays are bought by the Federal Reserve, which has an infinite checkbook. They can just poof money into existence. Foreigners don't want to buy U.S. debt anymore, and so in a roundabout way, the government is being funded by printing more money, resulting in inflation and, of course, a business cycle, right? It's Banana Republic type stuff. The St. Louis Federal Reserve reports that U.S. banks have $1.6 trillion in excess reserves, up from zero in 2008. Now, what this means is that these are reserves that banks are holding above the legal requirement, and the banks have to pay interest on them, and they have to suffer inflation by holding these reserves, right? So they have to pay money. They basically have to pay to sit on this money, right? They have to pay interest back to wherever they got these reserves from, and they have to deal with the inflation on that. So they're paying to hold on to this money. And so the banks have decided that it is better to pay interest and suffer from inflation than it is to invest in the United States. That is, they have deduced that the United States isn't just worthless investment, it is worse than worthless. That they will lose money if they choose to invest in the United States. Better to just take the sure losses that they'll take by paying interest on holding this money. If that doesn't count as a vote of no confidence, I don't know what does. Okay? More bad news is that the rate of startups Business startups per million in the United States has also declined. For example, in 1994, it was 2.12 startups per million people in the United States. In 2004, it was 2.08, and it remained pretty stable until 2008. 2008, it was 2.08 startups per million people. 2011, it was down to 1.73 startups per million. Okay? And less people are in control of the means of production. In addition, the wealth gap is widening, with the bottom 0 to 50% going from owning 3% of wealth in 1989 to 1.1% in 2010. Whereas the top 1% went from owning 30.1% in 1989 to 34.5% in 2010. Now, this is a substantial shift, especially at the very bottom levels, right? The bottom 50%, their wealth as a percentage of the economy has gone from 3% to 1.1%. So it's basically shrunk to a third of what it was in 1989, okay? But these trends are continuing. These trends are not stopping. But fear not, despite all this sour information, corporate profits are still higher than ever. We can look at corporate profits as a percentage of GDP. In 2004, they were 7.4%. In 2008, they were 8.2%. And in 2011, corporate profits were 11% of GDP. 11%. 11% of the economy was corporate profits. None of these problems are going to be solved by the U.S. federal government because nobody is going to attempt to solve them. The first thing you need to solve these problems is a nation willing to solve them. And the United States right now is not a nation. Simply not. Now, on this picture here is the proposed partition of the United States by the All Nations Party. The U.S. is to be divided into ideological countries. Though the specifics are subject to substantial revision, I made this map based on polling data and the political geography of the United States, and with an eye to contiguity, to not having too much breakup of the countries and their locations. When discussing alternative histories, one way to look at it is that you, right now, are living in an alternative history compared to what could have happened. The United States was not some inevitable thing. In regards to the national debt, I see this done by fobbing it off on each citizen of the United States. Each citizen is given their share of the national debt. And this is necessary because immediately following a partition of the United States, there will be mass expulsions and migrations of people. And so some countries will end up with smaller populations than they started with once this all shakes out. So a debt assignment on the basis of population will work better as the debt will follow the population levels. Now, one may view what I'm talking about, this partition, as pie in the sky, but the plan has to start somewhere. The goal has to start somewhere. Not only has reform so far not worked, but why do you even want reform in the U.S. to work? I fail to see how maintaining the United States as it is, instead of forming a country for people like you, is some great prize. It seems like a booby prize. Why save the United States when you can have your own country? Dislocation? Most people move multiple times in their lives. According to the U.S. Census, roughly 6% of the population moves substantially every year, or 14% move if you include movements within county. If we assume that 33% of the U.S. population would be forced to move as a result of partition, or will move voluntarily as a result of partition, that will be a lot of movement. But it's less than 5.5 times the annual rate already. And let's not kid ourselves, 5.5 times is a lot more people moving, but it's not inconceivably more. The United States is a fairly mobile country. And if we space out the migration over 5.5 years, then it would only be double the current rate of movement for 5.5 years. And if we space it out over 10 years, well, then the annual movement rate would be 9.3% instead of what it is now, 6%. So it's not that much of a big deal once you consider how much movement has already taken place. Sure, new school, new friends, but all this has been done before, and you know what you're in for. Though in some ways it will be even easier, since so many people will be moving around, it will become this normal thing to have a lot of new people. I recall when my grandmother lived in Illinois and moved to Florida. At first she didn't want to go because she felt that she had roots in Illinois. Well, having left for Florida, she was shocked at how all of her friends nonchalantly waved her by and how quickly she developed a new social network of equal size in Florida. And one that was actually better, since she wasn't maintaining old friendships out of inertia, maintaining friendships with people that she wouldn't befriend now if she just met them today. But before forming a more in-depth policy regarding expulsions, The All Nations Party has three major guidelines in regards to expulsions. One, retirees and people just running out the clock in an area cannot be expelled. Right? Basically dealing with people who are 70-year-old retirees, just want to live out their days on their porch, no expelling them. Two, expelled persons' land property cannot be seized nor eminent domain exercised. And three, people will be given at least 8 years' notice before being expelled from an area marked for a new country. The real issue is economic dislocation. Firms are going to have to incorporate new personnel in their operations, roughly a third, and to the extent that their personnel no longer matches the operations in an area, they will have to move their operations. Right? Now, the fear of dislocation is overblown. It looks huge until you actually look at the numbers and what is actually already being done. But for what dislocation there will be, one can think of it as a doctor fixing a broken arm. The first thing the doctor does is break it again so that it can heal properly. A polyglot country doesn't have a uniform interest in solving problems. It has sectarian interests, each trying to get what's best for their ideological or racial group. And this results in a tragedy of the commons and nonsense policies that follows no coherent plan because the country itself is incoherent. It's authoritarian to make people move. If you don't like this plan because forcing people to move is authoritarian, well, that ship has sailed. Public schools and the current tax structures alone represent a far greater intrusion into people's lives than forced emigration does. Right? And forced emigration, that would be a one-time thing anyway. And in terms of the hassle that forced emigration entails, it's nothing compared to the hassle of going through the public school system. And is it any more authoritarian than the wars that the United States gets involved in around the world? Such wars would be rendered impractical as the U.S. becomes divided up like Western Europe is. Now, if you're a libertarian who, even though this plan represents less intrusion than what the U.S. already does right now, you don't want to vote for it because expulsion is still some intrusion in people's lives, making people move around. Well, that's still some intrusion, even though it's less than what the U.S. federal government currently does. Well, I see that as similar to a concentration camp inmates being unwilling to break out because they would have to trample on some guy's pumpkin patch right just outside the gate. Okay, please, libertarians, get your heads out of your pumpkins and recognize the All Nations Party as the most realistic way to get what you want. Hopefully you can have a visceral understanding of the potential future of a partitioned USA. Okay? It starts off with moving and the whole hassle of moving, the company you work for having some program to maintain employment in a new area, or getting a new job in that area with new friends and a new school for your kids, if you have kids, then realizing that the people you're around are more like you. And then after, say, 3 years, things are starting to get better economically. The dislocation is starting to be worked out, and the general economy is more prosperous, promotions are easier to come by, jobs are easier to come by, and your dollar, or whatever the currency is, seems to go farther. And then you find it easier to get the medical services you need from either a universal healthcare plan or a free market healthcare plan, both of which are infinitely superior to this incoherent mess that the U.S. medical situation currently is. If you want to keep America together, ask yourself, what is an American? Is an American a racial type? Right? Do we define an American by their race? I don't think anyone believes this, so I'm just going to say no. By their economic ideology, by their views on economic policy? Well, certainly there is no agreement on economic policy in the United States, so it can't be that. Is it religion? Well, there's overwhelming support for Christianity, but there's also overwhelming support for Christianity in many countries, and they're not Americans, and moreover, there's all sorts of Christian sects in the U.S., and one can be a Muslim and be a citizen of the U.S., so it's not religion. I mean, American is not a theistic religion. Okay, so what is it? What is an American? It's not a racial type, it's not an economic ideology, it's not a theistic religion, so what is an American? And the answer that I've come to is an American is nothing. There is no such thing as an American. There are people who are citizens of the United States, but that's it. It's just a legal title. It's just a legal fruffery is all it is. There is no such thing as an American. There is no such thing as an America, except in terms of the political reality of the United States. That's all. And so if you say, well, I'm fighting for America, it's the United States federal government. It's Obama, it's drones, it's, gun control, which is really civilian disarmament. Okay? It's the national debt. It's all these wars. You want to say it's the Constitution? What Constitution? Your Constitution? Your idea of the Constitution? There is no America, is what I'm saying. And the problem is that people believe in America, and they have this sacralization of America with the fathers. How creepy is that? The fathers, and the sacred temples, and of course the sacred texts, right? Every religion has its sacred texts. And of course the age of miracles, right? Back when politicians were all honest and good, right? The fathers, right? That was the age of miracles. So you have all these elements. And all these elements create this religion of America, right? You have the little kiddies and their loyalty oath and their triumphalist history. And people who hate each other will get together in a group chant for the national anthem, national, as if they're some sort of nation. But the problem with this cult, this Americult, is that it causes people who should go their separate ways, who should live and let live, who would be much happier and much better off if they broke up the United States and made separate countries. It causes them to choose to stay together because of the Americult. But of course, they all have different ideas of what is America, and yet they all sacralize it, and they all think they're talking about the same thing because they all have the same flag, is really what it amounts to. Why insist on being chained to people who you hate and who hate you? Why? You have nothing to lose but those chains. You have a country to win. Join the All Nations Party.